Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first program in the 2025 Cultural Ethics series. And it's a real joy for me to be introducing today's speaker. And he's back by popular demand. He was a speaker last year, and everybody absolutely loved what he had to say. And that's Science Ambassador J.D. Stillwater. J.D. is a master storyteller with 40 years of experience as a science educator. He offers not just a new way of seeing things, but a new way of looking through a lens of wonder at the universe and our place in it. J.D. has made it his full-time mission, and I quote, to lead the wider culture toward a worldview that is better aligned with how reality works. To be effective in creating more sustainable systems, we must change the way we think. But how? We could look for insight for how nature works, close quote. So you're in for a treat. JD's subject is peace, love, understanding, and manure. Last year, JD reminded me at his talk that the banana is my cousin. I can't wait to hear what he says about manure. JD.
Good morning. Thank you, John. In 1986, I walked from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. on the Great Peace March for Global Nuclear Disarmament. And one of my fellows is here this morning. Pretty cool. It was a pivotal year in my life, and it changed me in so many ways. And it keeps showing up in my life now, almost 40 years later. And one of the lessons I learned that year, and seem to have to keep learning, goes by the shorthand manure warehouse in my head. But you need some background before I can even tell the story. The first organizer of the Great Peace March for Global Nuclear Disarmament was a nonprofit called Pro-Peace, which was short for People Reaching Out for Peace. And they attracted me out of college with visions of 5,000 people living and traveling in a vast tent city of 5,000 people, walking from LA to DC en masse, right? With hot showers every morning, rock star concerts every evening, and overwhelming impact. Well, we walked out of Los Angeles on March 1st, 1986, on schedule, but with only about 1,200 people, less than a third of the plan. A crippling lack of liability insurance, and Pro-Peace was staggering under $500,000 in debt that they hoped they could fundraise away once we were on the road. You can imagine how that worked out. 2 weeks later, as we walked into a little town called Barstow on the edge of the Mojave Desert. Anyone been to Barstow? So you know what I'm talking about. Well, Pro-Peace came out and announced that they were bankrupt and we should all go home. And about 2/3 of us did go home. What remained was a pretty diverse group, and we all did what we could. So the skilled mechanics removed essential pieces from the trucks that pulled our kitchen and our porta potties, thereby stymieing some of the repo men that had descended on our campsite. The attorneys among us sought an injunction against further repossessions, arguing that 400 people needed that stuff to survive a walk across the desert. And then they quickly cobbled together a new 501c3. Those of us with commercial kitchen skills, including me, made food. Musicians played in local bars. I think there are 2 or 3 in Barstow. And they played for tips that would go to the march, and so on. Our shower trucks got repossessed, and the media further relieved us of any glamour with gleeful headlines about the death of the Great Peace March. Nevertheless, we persisted. And 2 weeks later, we left Barstow and went out into the desert as a lean, scrappy, and sometimes kind of stinky band of 400 activists, determined to walk to Washington, D.C. for global nuclear disarmament. Why am I telling you this? Well, the March community remains close, maybe even as close as soldiers who've experienced combat together. As I said, we were a pretty diverse group, and although most of us remain committed to nonviolence and peace, and we're mostly liberal politically. Nearly 40 years have gone by, and things change. I'm not sure why, but some of the marchers have come to see me as emblematic of something, and they write to me on Facebook Messenger. And until the last couple of years, those conversations were always respectful, even in disagreement. Well, recently, meaning the last 3 or 4 years, 2 of those conversations with Peace March buddies have become extremely rude and crude, violent, and from my perspective, completely unhinged from reality. Well, after a while, I got tired of being called horrible names in spite of being mostly respectful myself. So I put these 2 people together in a group chat. And I admit I was partly motivated by entertainment value, but I honestly didn't know if they would mostly agree or disagree. I just knew they were both really passionate to the point of vehemence. Here's an excerpt from what ensued. Person A: I am too enlightened to be poisoning myself with that deranged, delusional, satanically insane, megalomaniac political bullshit. Got sublime soul, self-sovereign autonomy. I don't play brainless, satanic political games. Yeah. Person B: I hate what you stand for, and I can choose to do so. I now clearly know your politics. We are diabolically opposed. The Demoldrat said that if Trump is elected, there will be civil war. Bring it on, Marxist. Well, this kind of talking past one another continues for pages and pages, one claiming to be so spiritually enlightened that they're above all politics, while flinging violent insults toward everyone who isn't so enlightened, and the other labeling anyone who criticizes Donald Trump as a Marxist and an enemy they are eager to gun down. Please, do not let this account color your perceptions of the Great Peace March community. The vast majority of us are pretty mainstream people. I cherry-picked the 2 excerpts that I read to you to avoid the dozens of F-bombs and for being marginally intelligible. And of course, you can't see the entire sentences in all capital letters and the 5 exclamation points in a row. To be fair, there may be some mental illness involved here, but it got to me how we could have gotten to this point in a community of people who walked together for 9 months for peace. More importantly, I was dogged by the question of how to heal this. Not just among my friends, but more broadly, how do we heal this? The thing is, I already know. I know because of something I witnessed on the march in a warehouse full of manure. Once we were out of the desert and over the Rockies, which was a feat in itself, the marchers became deeply polarized around one particular issue, one that today, decades later, feels kind of petty and insignificant, but it was a big deal at the time. In the beginning, we had all walked together from campsite to campsite with banners and flags and a lot of fanfare. And as the days and miles wore on, the late-night campfire talkers and the early-to-bed, early-to-rise folks naturally, I see the nodding heads, naturally fell into 2 distinct patterns. You know, the early risers would get up with the sun and eat breakfast when it was served and leave with the flags at the regular time to walk to the next site. And in my memory, that was about half of us. The other half got up whenever they woke up, caught the end of breakfast or just skipped it, and hit the road when they felt like it. And this arrangement was great for preventing long lines at the porta potties and at the water trailer in the mornings and at the kitchen truck for breakfast. It also spread out the workload for those who were loading the trucks that carried our tents and our duffels, which was especially helpful, obviously, when it was raining. On the roads, it stretched out the column of marchers to miles long, visible throughout the whole day. But it also meant that drivers and local people along our route saw sporadic clumps of people walking with no banners or flags or anything to explain who we were or why we were walking through their county. It also meant that the people serving lunch at the halfway point had to wait a long time, which delayed their cleanup and whatever else they had to do. So we began to split into two polarizing factions. Those who thought we should march together in a unified group, and those who thought each marcher should have the freedom to walk when it was best for them. Well, we called our ever-moving encampment of tents Peace City. And actually, our mayor, I got to call you out. Diane is the mayor of Peace City, still is and always will be. Early on, the board of directors delegated most decisions to the Peace City Council, who was elected periodically by the marchers. Well, at some point, the early risers brought a proposal to City Council that would require everyone to start walking at the appointed time in the morning. And that didn't go over well, as you might imagine. Now, City Council's habit was to seek consensus whenever possible. So heated discussions about this ended usually by tabling the motion to the next meeting, where more people showed up and the discussion was even more heated and so on, until the entire community was factionalized. And it got more and more heated until it came to dominate most of our conversations. And some people talked about just going home. One afternoon, somewhere in eastern Colorado, at the height of this internal political storm, a real storm, complete with hail and tornado warnings, forced us to abandon our half-set-up tents and make a run for a sturdy metal roof building that stood next to the soggy farm field where Peace City was being erected. Relieved, all 500 of us at that point ducked inside, only to have our noses inform us that it was a storage facility for fertilizer, the natural kind. They had manure from pigs, cows, chickens, bats, you name it, all in these separate piles accessible by a big front loader. The piles were warmer than warm. Some of them were steaming. Just imagine the smell in there. But, you know, this was better than a surprise real-life casting in the roles of Dorothy and Toto. So we milled around in there as the storm raged outside. And we realized it might be a while, but most of us were kind of unwilling to sit anywhere in that building. And mind you, some of us didn't smell a whole lot better than those piles, but still. Well, at some point, someone got an idea and set up a microphone. They said something like, if you'd like to share the thoughts on the question of walking together, here's a microphone. Let's agree not to heckle, just get in line to speak, and otherwise, let's just listen. 2 minutes per speaker. Well, people did get in line. Oh boy, did they get in line. And as the hailstones roared down on the metal roof, people raged and stormed their anger and indignation into that microphone. It's a march, not a meander. Why the hell did you come on this if you aren't willing to make an impact? And how dare you try to legislate how I approach my activism? Hurtful things had been said, and there was a lot to express. It was both painful and cathartic. A lot of people would fill their 2 minutes and then immediately get right back in line. And both perspectives had valid points. We had come on this march to make an impact, and walking all strung out was diminishing that. On the other hand, people didn't give up a year of their lives just to be micromanaged by a bunch of control freaks, right? Besides, walking strung out allowed for deeper conversations with people on the sidelines and over breakfast in diners and coffee shops. Many more arguments on both sides were marshaled that day, too many to describe here. But after a while that seemed like forever, the line got a bit shorter. People started conceding points that they had previously rejected. The late walkers acknowledged that it wasn't actually too much to ask that they show up for breakfast, although they did not like the proposal to make it a requirement. The walk together folks conceded that there were some logistical and tactical advantages to walking spread out. And each of those little concessions created a tiny bit of political elbow room for actually considering the merits of the other perspective. The line got shorter and shorter until there were thoughtful pauses between the speakers. By the end of the hailstorm outside, the political storm inside had ended too, and the solution was obvious to everyone. No one proposed it, no one created it, no one enforced their will on anyone else. It was self-evident what we would do. We would choose to walk together when we walked through towns and cities, and we would walk however we each wanted through the rural countryside. City mode and country mode. So perfect, we wondered why we hadn't thought of it sooner. That day, in a manure warehouse somewhere in the vast plains of eastern Colorado, I learned that authentic sharing and open-hearted listening is the key not only to peace, but also to better solutions. Sometimes conceding the small truths we can admit in the other's perspective gives both parties the grace to seek another way, some third or fourth way that isn't even possible while entrenchment rules the debate. Note that the resolution to the march's divisive question of how to walk each day required no new rules, no city council decisions, no vote, no enforcement. It was obvious. And to be clear, there remained a very small scattering of people on each side that continued to either get up at midday or to cast disgruntled looks at those who did. You know, full consensus is rarely achievable in large groups of human beings. But the overwhelming majority of us actually loved and celebrated city mode and country mode, partly because of how we came to it. Let me suggest that there may be similar solutions to thorny questions like abortion and immigration. For example, liberals like me could admit that abortion is not a universal good, and that it would be better for people to have all the tools they need to prevent unwanted pregnancies in the first place, right? If pro-lifers can concede that the goal is to minimize the number of abortions rather than to control and punish sexuality, we could work together to truly make abortion safe, legal, and rare. I think the pro-choice folks could emphasize the "and rare" part much more than we have. That kind of conversation is not possible without some measure of what Dr. King called beloved community. We have to muster enough love for our opponents to listen patiently to their stupid, ignorant, misinformed, their thoughtfully held and cherished perspectives. Perspectives that might actually have merit somewhere deep down below the piles of manure. Whatever soapbox that they're standing on, right? Like this one. I'm not likely to succeed at loving a random stranger on the internet with enough genuine concern for a fruitful conversation. But my relatives who watch different news from me and who I know voted differently from me, those people I actually do care about, no matter how misinformed I might think they are. I think that we think our politics are broken, and maybe they are, but politics is just a collective term for relationships. Relationships are what's broken, and relationships are mostly face-to-face, local, person-to-person. In the summer of 2020, our daughter, Reverend Robin Stillwater, was a chaplain at a New York City veterans hospital. Remember New York in the summer of 2020? COVID spread through the hospitals like a tornado, turning healthy people into corpses in a few weeks. She couldn't even sit with her patients or hold their hands as they slowly suffocated. She had to stand outside the door. She watched dozens of her patients, veterans, people she had come to care about, get stacked into refrigerator trucks day after day because the morgues were already full. Someone heard about her work and what she was doing, and they asked her, "How do you stay positive?" And she said, "I don't. I stay connected." If we want to heal the divides in our relationships, personally and globally, an essential prerequisite is staying connected. Which reminds me that I have to address mis- and disinformation somewhere this morning. Well, a few months ago, I was surprised to come across a thread on Facebook in which someone pointed out that our human ancestors evolved in Africa and migrated to other continents. That wasn't what was surprising. There's tons of evidence for that, right? What was surprising was the many others who responded. I hear you. I do. What surprised me was all these other people who responded by shouting in all caps that the out of Africa theory has been totally debunked. Well, debunked is a strong word. And I happen to know a fair amount about evolution, so I chimed in asking for a source. And one of them actually provided one, which was refreshing. It was a mainstream press article with a headline something like, "New Evidence Undermines Out of Africa Theory of Human Origins." I went there, and the text of the article described some new evidence indicating that humans left Africa several times, rather than in one single migration event, as had been thought previously. And we've known for a while that our ancestral line interweaves with Neanderthals and Denisovans, Erectus, and other Homo species, with really complex interbreeding and many migration events, both directions, but clearly originating in Africa. So this new evidence the article was talking about, it offered some new wrinkles about later back and forth migrations, thereby lightly modifying the original out of Africa theory slightly, but confirming its essential truth that our first Homo ancestors evolved in Africa and then migrated out. Well, it seemed to me that the folks on Facebook had only read the headline and reached their own foregone conclusion that their ancestors were never Africans. In 2019, I had an exchange with an old friend who is prone to believing conspiracy theories. And I asked him, "How do you know if something is true?" And he was honest. He said, "If it feels true to him." In reply, I should have sent him some optical illusions, but instead, I said, "I don't think we can have a fruitful discussion about what's true if I'm bringing him evidence that doesn't feel right to him, and he's bringing me feelings that don't match reality." And that dynamic makes the manure warehouse approach really challenging. Because it's not just that we have two polarized factions with different perspectives. It's that one of them, maybe both, are being fed a steady diet of misinformation and disinformation, and it's getting harder and harder to tell what's true. Misinformation is when someone gets something wrong. So those people who thought out of Africa had been debunked, they were peddling misinformation. They may have a racist agenda, but they're not deliberately peddling lies. They think their understanding of the headline is true. Disinformation is propaganda. Fake news created deliberately and pushed out to deceive people in service of an agenda. And I'm seeing more of it every week. And AI makes it look so real, even videos. But then both types of bad information get promoted by a clickbait media landscape that rewards sensationalism. And this is not new. William Randolph Hearst made a fortune in what was then called yellow journalism, and some historians claim it was responsible for causing the Spanish-American War in 1898. That year, an editorial in the New York Press, which was itself a journal for newspaper editors, said, quote, "The public is becoming heartily sick of fake news and fake extras. Some of the newspapers in this town have printed so many lying dispatches that people are beginning to mistrust any statement they make." End quote. Sound familiar? I think if we want to survive the current turmoil, America needs epistemology. What is epistemology besides some obscure SAT word? Well, humans are prone to bias. We believe all kinds of things that aren't true. We have mental habits that lead us astray, and many of them seem to be built into our evolved nature. Here's just a couple examples. Call out the answer quickly, nice and loud. The sun is up all day. What is up all night? Nope. The moon is in the daytime sky exactly half the time. This week, it comes up around noon and stays up till about midnight, and it's in its half-moon phase. Stars are up all the time, too. You just can't see them in the daytime. So there's no right answer to that fill in the blank. Now you're on your guard, right? So you'll do better on this one. How many senses do we have? Oh, you're just more reticent now. Yeah. Aristotle, more than 2,000 years ago, said we have 5 senses. But you know, we've learned a few things in the last 2,000 years. What about our sense of balance? Time, temperature, pain, nausea, itch, the need for a restroom. How do we sense these things? Well, we actually have between 10 and 40 senses, depending on how you group them together. It's just momentum that makes us say 5. Weird but true, there are taste buds in your anus and your ears. I will stop there. If you want to know about all your senses, Wikipedia has a great article. Just Senses is the title of it, and I helped shape that article. We know that a long list of biases is built into the human operating system. It just is. Confirmation bias, implicit biases, hindsight bias, status quo bias, the Dunning-Kruger effect. The list of normal cognitive biases is long, too long to cover in one talk. Over 180 of them have been described in the literature. And the list of theories about why we have all these tendencies is nearly as long. So I'll leave that to you to explore, and I hope you will. I think learning about my inborn biases and fallacies is a spiritual practice, as much as honesty and integrity are. I want to minimize how I distort reality for myself and for those I influence. And yes, all of us distort reality to some extent, no exceptions. So I am still talking about epistemology. There's this entire branch of philosophy that's near and dear to science called epistemology. It's the study of knowledge and how we know what we know. Is something true because it feels true? Because it appears true? How much evidence is required? Well, there are many different schools of epistemology, and I don't want to get into those weeds this morning. What I want to say is that America needs epistemology. We need to pause our debates about what is true in order to reach a consensus about how we know and what constitutes adequate evidence for a claim. People who won't read past a headline should not get equal time with the people who publish the studies that are referred to in that headline. Just my opinion. Unfortunately, logic, critical thinking, and evidence-based reasoning are not part of human nature's default. Appeals to raw emotionality are always going to trump appeals for evidence. Social media are profitable because we get a dopamine hit. We get a little reward from information that feels true, even if it isn't. This leads to truth decay. We might need a mental hygienist to give us a dispute canal. They might have to use a dung depressor. Those puns are truly awful. But they're right. Social media platforms allow all kinds of pernicious untruths to spread unchecked, decaying and diluting our access to truth. And all of this is happening while science makes huge strides forward in understanding our evolved human foibles, the ways we fail over and over again to be the rational, objective thinkers that we think we are. We know all about different kinds of inherent bias, but we haven't learned how to apply the knowledge to ourselves. It's much easier to see someone else's bias and hypocrisy than it is to notice my own, let alone to go about correcting my own. Many years ago, a nice old lady landlord of ours said, and I quote, "I'm not prejudiced against black people, I just don't think they keep their places very nice," end quote. See how easy that is, recognizing the bias in others? I'm sure it wasn't so obvious to her. We did our part by being lily-white tenants who didn't keep the place very nice. My point is that it's really hard to overcome these biases in ourselves, even when we have good information. We don't. Some studies estimate that even back in 2023, the percentage of Twitter accounts that were actually bots was as high as 65%. And we know that some of the most active bots are controlled by Russian state actors. So, all this makes me want to throw up my hands and quit humanity. If we can't have a sincere conversation until we share an epistemology, and that can't happen in the current media mess, then all is lost, right? It turns out one viable path forward combines the manure warehouse with something we all have built into our operating system: genuine curiosity. Getting curious embodies a robust epistemology, even if no one in the conversation knows that word. By bringing your genuinely curious self to the conversation, you are intrinsically modeling a search for knowledge that's based on evidence. Question the questionable. And I don't mean question the other person's integrity or motivations. I just mean asking questions. Why do you think that? Interesting. I hadn't heard that. Where did that information come from? How do you know? Tell me more about that. When we express genuine interest in another person's perspective and invite further elaboration of it without contradicting it, they are forced to dig deeper into their own reasoning. And once there, they are far more able to see their own errors than they would be if you pointed them out. Unfortunately, the most important word there is genuine. If you can't hold your horses that want to bolt straight into, "That's not true," they won't reach the epiphany on their own. And any evidence you present will be no match for their defensiveness. In turn, we should be able to cite our sources and to change our minds when presented with good evidence and good reasoning. It ain't easy, though. It takes effort to override our long-standing convictions and certainties. How many senses do we have? It calls for some uncomfortable humility. And humility was built into the context of having a hard conversation in a warehouse full of manure. In other contexts, we have to gather our humility around us. Speaking of humility, there are some things we can never know. We have to enter the public debate ready and willing to admit that many aspects of life and history, even in science and mathematics, there are some things that are simply ambiguous at best. We just can't nail them down. So it's okay to admit that we just don't know something. Authenticity breeds authenticity. It's not very good for fundraising, though. Outrage works better for fundraising. And outrage is how we got into this mess. I want to be deliberate about where I place my attention so I don't get jerked around by AI-created videos of impossible storms, right? One caveat to all this. None of us has the time to track down every bit of information to its evidentiary sources. Sooner or later, we have to trust someone else's account. I'll bet that very few of you here this morning could make a convincing, evidence-based case for a spherical Earth in a debate with a well-prepared flat earther. We trust our teachers and our experts. We have to. Is it enough to point out that 99% of climate scientists believe human activities cause global heating? Doesn't that percentage by itself constitute evidence for anthropogenic climate change? On the other hand, truth shouldn't be a popularity contest, right? But sometimes we have little choice. Do I have to get a PhD in everything myself? My point is that in science, we're rarely talking about hard facts or certain certainties, but rather strong probabilities and margins of error. I would bet a lot based on the testimony of 99% of knowledgeable climate experts. I would happily pay more for gasoline and much higher taxes based on that highly probable, but not quite 100%, right? We also have tools we can use. There are fact-checking groups out there that do really good evidence-based work. Use them. There's a company called Ad Fontes, A-D-F-O-N-T-E-S, Ad Fontes Media, and they use politically diverse teams to rate news sources for accuracy and bias. They're wonderful. Snopes is still a thing. PolitiFact, factcheck.org, Open Secrets. There are lots of tools out there. We can use them. A quick comment about critical thinking. I think it's a little too easy to decry America's deplorable critical thinking. I know that many of my neighbors and friends are thinking critically, using bad information from sources they trust. There's a great quote about that, and there's a little book titled Days of Healing, Days of Joy. It's a daily reader for adult children of alcoholics and other dysfunctional families. And the quote is attributed to someone named Dana J., who writes, quote, "I finally figured out that my dad's opinion was no better than his information, and his information was wrong," end quote. Are we sharing and listening vulnerably? Is there enough goodwill, enough common sense to take shelter together in this nation-sized manure warehouse and just talk? Are we curious enough to rise out of our own manure piles and consider new options that might benefit everyone? Manure can smell pretty bad, but the nutrients it contains are tremendously valuable to farmers. That's why there was a manure warehouse. And poop plays a huge role in the evolution and sustainability of ecosystems, from fish poop to bird guano to buffalo chips, right? I don't know how big a role the manure in that building played that day in Colorado. But I can't help but notice that the combination of the storm and the manure, it forced us into an uncomfortable context, one where we didn't have much choice but to talk and listen humbly. Are we there yet in America? Are we there in our politics, by which I mean our relationships? It seems to me that the pace of threatening change is like the storm, and our social media landscape is like the piles of manure, disgusting and stinky, but rich with potential. After days of vitriol between my two fanatical friends on Messenger, I chimed in to remind them about that day in the manure warehouse. One of them conceded that they could be a better listener and made moves in that direction. The other one continued to insist that we were both his enemies and that anyone not in support of Trump is by definition a Marxist and therefore deserving prison or worse. As I said, mental illness may be a factor here. I know I can't achieve reconciliation with everyone. The question is, Am I able to engage my curiosity enough to listen compassionately? Listening doesn't imply agreement. In these times, authentic, earnest, curious listening may be all we have. The best part of the story is that on November 15th, 1986, the Great Peace March for Global Nuclear Disarmament walked into Washington, D.C., 20,000 strong and on schedule. We had crossed endless cornfields in country mode, enjoying the scenery and good conversations in leisurely singles and pairs. We had marched in a loud, compact, unmistakable column through small towns like Coralville, Iowa, and down the glass canyons of big ones like Chicago, Cleveland, and New York. Tom Atlee, a fellow marcher and founder of the Co-Intelligence Institute, says that he marks that day in the Manure warehouse as the birth of the Institute. He later wrote, and this gets complex, it's a quote within a quote. He wrote, quote, "In 1992, I was browsing through Jerry Mander's book, In the Absence of the Sacred, when a quote leapt off the page. It was from Oren Lyons, faith keeper of the Turtle Clan of the Onondaga Iroquois, describing traditional tribal councils. He said," here's the quote within the quote, "We meet and just keep talking until there's nothing left but the obvious truth." End quote from Oren Lyons. And now this is Tom Atlee again. "I recognized that we'd stumbled upon something that the Iroquois have known for hundreds of years." End quote. It doesn't seem like it should be that hard to just listen, right? But I struggle to do it over and over again. It's simple and it's difficult. May we continue to stumble upon and apply this ancient and priceless human technology of genuine listening and sharing, invoking our best curiosity, and keeping all of that close to heart as we weather the present storms with curiosity and humility. May it be so.